Hello, thank you for that, Deirdre. It's actually so lovely to hear you talking about the kind of aftermath of that project, because I'm no longer working at the Gaelic school, so I haven't actually seen the results of that. So I love that the children are still keeping that up. So my name's Lydia Brownlee. I'm a primary school teacher and was working at Glendale Gaelic School for a supply cover during the pandemic. And I was lucky enough to get invited at that time to deliver Deirdre's project as part of Make Learn. Very fortunately for me, I also happened to have a pollution kind of IDL project going on at the same time, which worked really, really well with the craft, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So my prior experience before doing this project, I'd done a design degree, so I had maybe greater confidence than I would otherwise have done in terms of delivering a visual arts workshop or craft workshop, but I didn't have much sewing experience and I hadn't done any darning before at all. So I was really kind of out of my comfort zone in terms of craft. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience of delivering the project practically, and then a little bit about why I think craft is important and how it can link in with other curricular areas. So when I got given the materials for the repairing project, before we kind of got to the prep point of doing the making in the classroom, I completed the activity by myself. So I took the darning mushroom home, I took a sock, and I had a go at mending it myself, just so that I knew the process that we were going to go through and could see what would be those snagging points in the packaging. I identified some changes that I needed to make, just very little things before I delivered it, such as pre-teaching some of the skills. So going right back to basics, thinking about how do we thread a needle, how do we fasten a thread on and off. So before we started on the project, before I'd even introduced Make Learn, we just did a little 15-minute slot in the class, all trying to thread a needle, all trying to tie a knot in a string and in a thread, and that really helps to make it a little bit more of a smooth process when we actually came to darning our items. So the children were asked to bring in something to school that was wholly, but it was not too precious. We knew that it would be maybe not the neatest darning, so we didn't want anything too expensive coming in, but also the children and again their families seemed to be really proud of these items afterwards, so it was a really good outcome. We completed session 1 of the project, which was, Deirdre kind of mentioned part of it, talking about creating a tag for your clothing that describes where it's come from, the materials that I've made, and kind of the journey of the item. So we discussed ideas of the circular economy and of fast fashion, and started to open up those avenues of questioning about where clothes come from, why it's important to mend things. So that's kind of where we were at before we started actually sewing in the classroom. So this is the part that I imagine if you're anything like me, gave me a little bit of fear beforehand, just the idea of having all of this going on in the classroom all at once, but it actually was really successful. So I decided to switch around the order of the projects that were in Deirdre's pack. So we did the patching element first, and when I'd practiced it I found that a lot easier because it's just doing a running stitch around the side of the patch. So we introduced with that in the morning. I decided to do it as a kind of 2-day a 1-day focused on doing the task. So I didn't do any of my literacy and things through the day. That I just focused on the Make Learn and did it all at once. So we did the patching in the morning, and then we had a go at doing the darning in the afternoon. There was quite a lot of I'm stuck, I can't do this, I can't get my needle to thread at the start, and I kind of had set up a system of I'll put your names on the board and I'll get to you when I get to you, and by the time I'd got to people's names, by and large they'd actually fixed it themselves. So the children were realising if I persevere at this, I can do it quicker than the teacher will get to me, which was really good because it taught them to kind of stick with something, and if something's tricky, just keep going, give it another go. It was open-ended, so when children had kind of finished patching, some of them started embroidering their own designs onto them, helping other children. So I didn't have that. I didn't have children going, what am I going to do next? It was obvious that they could carry on using their sewing skills, and they were really excited to do that. So the picture that we have here is actually You can see the girl in the class had patched her leggings, and then she decided to use her extra material to make a little scarf for herself, and was really pleased with what she'd come up with. So the impact of this in my classroom, I put a couple of quotes from the children there. There was a huge sense of achievement. So at the end of the day, even the ones who'd been maybe a little bit reluctant at the start of the day, or had been really finding it tricky to get that needle threaded, and maybe didn't have the darning that looked the most beautiful, but everyone was really proud because they'd managed to do something. They'd managed to mend that hole in the sock, or they'd mended a rip in a t-shirt. So there's a massive sense of achievement. The focus on the process was really helpful. So it helped us to think about maybe not the final appearance of the garment that we'd made, but the things we'd learned along the way, the functionality of it as well. So it didn't have to look perfect, but it could do its job. And that links in with all the stuff that we do in the class around growth mindset all the time. And it also offers a life skill to children. So I think it's brilliant that these children know how to thread a needle now. They can put a button on clothing if that comes off. They can mend a sock. So that's something that just carries on forward and makes you kind of feel like you can take on a challenge yourself. So I think those were the important impacts of the project. Kind of more widely from this, the benefits of learning about craft in schools, it was building connections with the relatives that maybe knit or sew in the family. One of the children was talking about someone in the islands who has a boat, and they'd helped working on the boat with her granddad. So it's all of these stories that come in when you start talking about what do we know about craft, how are things made. And it also helps us to think about maybe the history of our community and things that were going on before you could go to Primark and buy something really quickly. Who was making the clothes? Where did they come from? It opens up these wide conversations about culture, history and sustainability by interrogating everyday objects to understand kind of ideas and processes that are so important in our modern society, the business of production, and where the things that we need come from. Just get my next bit up. Sorry. The challenge of making something had such a good level of difficulty. The basic skills were quite straightforward and could be taught straight away, but there's so much space for growth in sewing. So if children wanted to carry on doing that, like the one that we've heard about, there's so much improvement that you can see every time that you do sewing or do darning. So it models the perseverance that's needed to improve the skills across the curriculum. I really liked what Deirdre said about getting lost in making with your hands. There was such a lovely environment in the classroom when we took part in this project. At points it actually got really quiet, and as children got really focused, the task was just tricky enough to focus in on and maintain concentration, and it was a really calming and mindful activity. I also think that these things can be really useful for facilitating conversations between children. It's easier to have a chat when your hands are doing something. So it was a really lovely, I think, like mental health break for the children as well. Whenever I hear about something like this that sounds great on paper to do in the classroom, I'm always kind of thinking, well, where am I going to fit that into my day? We're all really busy. So I've had a little think about how I see it fitting in with so many things across the curriculum. So as I mentioned, I was working on a pollution project whilst I was at the point when I delivered this in the class. And so it linked really well into this IDL topic. There was a natural link between the art and design that we were doing, but also we got into such interesting conversations about plastic pollution, microplastics, waste, fast fashion. So there was such a rich theme of learning to come from this craft project, especially good links with learning for sustainability, which is such a focus at the moment. So I've put together a few ideas of how the mending project would link with curricular areas that I'll talk about on the next slide, but this is just an example. It could be done starting from really any other craft. Ceramics, weaving, paper making, all of these have natural connections with sustainability, business. So I'll show you some examples on here. So I've put a few of the E's and O's at the bottom that I thought linked in with the wider project that I did around the making. You can see that in maths, we can think about making a mending business, calculating the material cost, thinking about the living wage and how the cost of a garment doesn't maybe reflect how much time has gone into it. Thinking in science about testing materials. Deirdre was talking about how children have maybe not come across the threads before or the needles before. So you're getting an experience of different materials and the properties of them as well. That links in really well with science. In social studies, there's so many things that we could do. So we learned about different types of pollution, microplastics, water pollution, thinking about where clothing and materials come from and why, and that opens up so much discussion around simply looking at like where these places are on the map that are written in our clothes, but also thinking about how things are transported, and then moving on with older years maybe into thinking about the ethical trade of clothes and how to make sure things are fair within the fashion industry. In expressive arts, we could think about creating the personal embroidery on the mended item, creating designs, looking at the work of a craftsperson like Deirdre Nelson, and thinking about maybe the colours that we're using, complementary colours in the patching and the darning. I'm going to have a look on the next slide at a literacy idea that I used in class. There's a lot of story writing you can do around the idea of a craft object. So the idea of a mended item and where it's maybe been, the stories of how it got all of the holes in it. And then other crafts, like thinking of maybe ceramic objects being like a magical item, or jewellery objects as a kind of hook for getting children into a writing project. We did a persuasive writing activity of writing about reducing clothing waste, so to persuade people to recycle and mend their clothes. And you could also look at making instructional writing and how-to videos about how to actually do the craft itself. So there's so many links that this can have with the rest of the curriculum. So you're hitting a lot of E's and O's through the delivery of a craft project. And finally, I'm just going to talk through how one of these craft activities can link with literacy through the higher order thinking skills questioning. So it's really nice to bring in a craft object to the class. So the example here is some really lovely pottery, and if you can have it and pass it around, and the discussion that comes out of that can be really valuable. So I think a lot of the kind of tactile element of having the object in front of you really sparked a lot of conversation that's brilliant for like talking and listening skills, and then as a stimulus for further writing, and also just using those thinking skills to imagine where the object has come from, think of a title for the object and the use of the object. So building up connections with what the children already know, and the objects that they might have in their home, and extending that out into the wider world, and learning about craft at the same time. So I'm going to stop talking there because I know that there'll probably be a lot of questions, and it would be really interesting to hear about